So Vikram promised me that I would be managing Louis Vuitton as a project manager if I came to Infomentum. That really motivated me to join, but that actually wasn't the case. Instead, I got an IoT sensor project around repairing cars on the cloud. I guess in my 10 years, I've had 4 different roles at Infomentum. Again, maybe that's kind of one of the reasons why I've been able to celebrate 10 years here, is because I've never felt like static. I've never been in a role where I've thought, oh, I'm not learning anything anymore. If ever I felt in that position, I've gone, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready for the next opportunity, the next role. What else can I do? My one thing is I'm really strict about, 2 things actually. One is managing expectations. So if I can't deliver something, or I know I won't be able to, I make sure that from the outset I make that very clear. I think another one is I'm really strict with my time. 5:30, no matter how much work I have on, I will say, no, I'm done, and I need to go and pick up my girls, and I need to spend time with the family. Now, I don't always, that doesn't always mean I don't log on or I won't do something later. Probably one of the most challenging periods will be both moments when I went on maternity leave and then came back from maternity leave. The first time, when I had my oldest daughter, Isla, I took a year off and I came back to work full time after a year. And that was incredibly challenging, not least because technology had moved on so much in that time. And then a lot had changed at Infomentum. It was a massive learning curve. In sales, you come back to zero pipeline. You come back and you're effectively starting over every single time. Your confidence is knocked because you've been out of work for so long. You've taken on an entirely new identity. You've become a new person in that time. So you don't necessarily feel as confident as you did beforehand. In that first year, when your kids go to nursery or childminder or whatever you do, they just get every single bug under the sun. Like I remember one doctor once referred to nursery as a wonderful melting pot of diseases, because like it really is. Like they get everything and it's so good for them. But also you're in that situation where you're at work, and at this point, 5 days a week in the city, commuting 2 hours a day. So you're at work and then you get the call, okay, someone needs to go and collect your child. And then it's at that point where you're literally calling your husband and, going, it's your turn. No, it's your turn. Or whose job's more important? Or my job's more important. And, and then like the tension starts between, in your relationship as well, because you're kind of having to choose between work and kind of personal. I think I learned quite a lot in that time, and I decided that if I had another child, I would do it entirely differently. So the second time around, I decided only to take 7 months of maternity leave, and I came back to work part-time. And then I built that up slowly. So I slowly moved to 4 and then full-time. Gratitude, or the things that I really love about Infomentum, having that flexibility to do that, that I could come back part-time and slowly build up my days, and I could do that on my terms when I was ready. Definitely all the work that we do in the public sector, I do find that really rewarding. Being able to work on projects where you're making a difference, to the end user. I find different parts of my role rewarding, depending on, what motivates me. I still, even now I'm in a position where I lead the team. But even now, when I close a new logo, or the thrill of closing an account, I still love that feeling, the adrenaline of closing something from a sales perspective. When I start to see the outcomes from projects that we've sold, kind of once they've been delivered, you remember those initial challenges or those initial visions, when you started engaging with the customer. I think that's the piece that I find really rewarding. Back in December, we onboarded Alpha as a customer, for example. And so Alpha run courses for people around the world, and they could be courses on marriage counseling, on religion, on different things. And, in the work that we do, being able to provide that integration and all the services that we've done for that customer, for them to be able to help even more people. The work that we're doing in policing at the moment around the victim journey, being able to play some part in that victim of a crime, being able to have a better experience when engaging with police forces. I mean, that's like really big, important work. gosh, I sometimes feel I want to just tap out when you're managing a team and people need you and they often need your support and they often asking you questions, which is great because it's, it's what you do. But then I've got these two girls that also are very needy. And some days, when my girls are just asking me all these things and then I go straight into work and then, my team is asking me all these things, I literally feel like flying to a remote island and to never be available for anyone to contact me ever again. I guess parenting as like this deck of cards where if everything goes well, all these cards are kind of like stacked up. And then if one thing goes wrong, like the one child gets sick, then all of a sudden this entire stack of cards just comes tumbling down. And I love the analogy because I think it's really true. It's some days it's everything just works really well. And then others, you're just kind of firefighting. It's funny that when thinking about this, I don't think about the actual kind of, I guess, work event associated, but it's often the place and the time. We were presenting to Nike in Amsterdam, for example, and, we had a brilliant presentation. It was amazing. We had a little bit of time just before we went back to the airport, and kind of back towards the airport, you can go and see the tulip gardens. It's only a certain amount, it's only a couple of months a year, I think, when they're kind of in their best. So it's like the moments like that, I guess, kind of post a presentation where you've managed to fit something in. I remember, when thinking about starting your career and getting into it is all about the piece around recruitment and how we advertise jobs. And there's a lot of data and evidence that suggests that traditionally how we have been writing job descriptions and recruiting hasn't necessarily been in favor for women. So as women, we tend to look at a job specification and only apply for a job if we meet 100% of the requirements, for example. And that's something that I see that is really true, but not just, when it comes to applying for jobs, but I think when it comes to taking on any challenge, we really believe that we need to be perfect. And so I think probably my biggest advice would be, just go for it. So, you are good enough. There's a massive gap for women in IT and in technology. I think it's an industry where there really needs to be more of us. We have a different perspective. We have unique skills that we can bring to this industry. As salespeople, we need empathy. At the end of the day, it's about people. And it's about understanding and passion. And I think these are all things that as women, we're really, really good at. And I just don't see enough of us. And I think I've seen in the press lately, there's been a lot about the cost of childcare. It is a real barrier to equality. I really hope to see the government doing more in that space to give women the opportunity to enter back into work after they decide to have kids, because I think that's, if that's what you want, I think that's really important. For now, I would love for Infomentum to support as many customers as possible. So I feel like we've got a lot more to give, and I've got a lot more growing to do here. I joined the leadership team about a year ago, and being part of that strategy and making those decisions and feeling like I'm in my position, I'm affecting real change within the business and the business growth. If I think about a theme for the 10 years, I think it probably would be change and maybe resilience. Things when you set out on a journey, they don't always go the way you expected. When I started with Infomentum, I started in a project management role. I never planned to go into sales. And after about a year in a project delivery role, I realized I had a real interest in kind of sales and marketing. And it was at that point that Infomentum then offered me this possibility of a career path, so being able to switch careers. I remember starting in that role, and I was probably about 5 months in, and I was working on a deal. It was my first deal, and we went for dinner with Andy Martin, who was a sales leader in Oracle at the time, and I still to this day really respect him as a sales leader. And I was telling Andy about this deal, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh yeah, well, it's yours to lose." And at the time, I didn't realize that he was baiting me. I was absolutely determined to prove him wrong. And I went on and I won that deal. And I went back to him later, said, well, by the way, I did close that, account the Friday before lockdown. Actually, we were moving that weekend. We were relocating to the countryside. And I remember waking up on the Monday morning, and I had a 3-year-old at home. My husband was a key worker, so he was going into the office still. And I was 5 months pregnant. And at the time, 2 or 3 of our biggest customers all put all of their projects on hold. And I remember having these calls and having the entire company pretty much just looking at us going, what are you going to do? And I think at that moment, we just had no idea what we were going to do. We didn't have any experience of this happening. I had no experience of selling in a pandemic. I had no idea how anyone would buy in that time. And I had this 3-year-old at home who couldn't be by herself or not be entertained for longer than 15 minutes. And I was 5 months pregnant. And I just remember it being absolutely awful, just so stressful. I think I felt this overwhelming responsibility for every single person's job, and that it was kind of my responsibility to sell in this climate, because else, they were at risk of losing their jobs. And then all of a sudden, kind of 2 or 3 months later, just everything started to move. And all of a sudden, all these customers started to realize that, they had to change in this time. And, that these programs are important and they had to move forward. And actually, in retrospect, that year, we actually had one of our best years we've ever had. And I guess now, if I look back to that March, literally it still gives me goosebumps. It was so awful. If I look back to that, first March, I just would never have imagined that year we would go on to be so successful in the remaining months and, do our best numbers yet. You just need to kind of take every opportunity and just jump in and kind of go for it.